And this starts at 11:15 roughly.
Should be able to hear you.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
It's on. I'm gonna go back.
Okay, I'm gonna plug.
Make sure we're good. Right one. I'll go back. Make sure it's on.
Okay.
So
Okay. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
yeah, got nothing.
Hello.
There you go.
Can y'all hear me? Is that working okay? Okay. Mixed answers here. Yeah, he gets to turn it up, so I think we'll get that done. Well, I know some of you all decided to sit so far away. Am I blocking your view, or is everybody able to see? Yes. Thumbs up, you can see? Thumbs up, you can hear? Oh, thumbs down. I lost my facilities person. Oh, there you are. Are you able to turn it up just a smidge more? All right, testing, 1, 2, 3. We good? All right, great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Sara Proppe, and I run a business called Proximity Project. And the goal of Proximity Project is really seeking to educate and activate churches to leverage their properties as assets to serve the local community. I come from an urban planning and a real estate development background, and I just really began to see this distinct opportunity for churches to creatively use their properties for connecting with their neighborhoods. I'm a longtime churchgoer myself and have a heart for the church, and so as I saw this opportunity, I decided to press into it and to start Proximity Project. So it's a joy to be with you all here today and to share a bit about where I come from and the story of place in the Bible, and then how you can think about that here with your own property as House of Hope Presbyterian Church. And a fun little fact about me too is I live in the neighborhood just a couple blocks away. So I'm very familiar with this piece of land and have appreciated the beauty of the House of Hope property. So let's go ahead and get started. Take a moment, if you will, to close your eyes and imagine a favorite place that you have. What things or people are there? Is there a particular smell? Or maybe a familiar sound? How does this place make you feel? I imagine that most of you, in walking through that imaginative exercise, have a particular story that you associate with that place, particular people, particular interactions you've had. So a lot of the places that we are drawn to because they're part of a story. They're part of our lives. We often use the terms space and place fairly interchangeably in our lives, but there's actually a strong distinction between these two things. So when you think of space, a lot of times it can be undefined, maybe limitless, have no boundaries. You think of this like outer space, right? Or we talk about internet, virtual space. Literally, that doesn't have physical boundaries, right? But place is different. Place is where a story is told, where there's shared meaning. An example that I like to give for this is think of a college dorm room. So dorm rooms are pretty nondescript, pretty standardized, pretty bare, and a lot of times kind of ugly places, right? Spaces, if you will. But then when the college student moves in and they put their posters up on the wall, they put their pictures up, it becomes a place that is distinct to who they are, right? Because there's a story being told. You're starting to learn a bit about their lives, about who they are, the things that they enjoy. And so that's a good example of how a space becomes a place as a story is told. Well, the Bible is a story of place. We have actually in Genesis, God starts out and it says, the earth without form was void. It was a space. But then he began creating boundaries. He began creating animals and nature and human beings, right? And it started to take the shape of a place. And not only that, we are a placed people. God created humankind and he placed them in a garden. We have here in Genesis 2:8, God planted the Garden of Eden in the east. We're even given an orientation, right? It's actually in the east. And there he put the man whom he had formed. We also see it in Jesus when he came to earth. The Word became flesh, but he was of a particular place. He was Jesus of Nazareth. And I think it's really interesting to think about that in terms of the way we interact with one another. How often is it when we're at a party or meeting somebody new, one of the first questions that we ask is, where are you from? It's also something that we often use very quickly to define ourselves. I'm a Texan, for example, and most people know that out of the gate pretty quickly with me. And so it's very much a way that we describe ourselves. And it is ultimately by place is how we are oriented. Leonard Jarmelson, he wrote a book called No Home-like Place, and he writes, to hold a view of the world where God becomes flesh is to acknowledge that God loves places. He loves the particular. So we are a placed people. Not only that, God did not only place us, but he designed us from a place, in a place, and for a place. So from, again, we see here in Genesis 2:7, it says that God formed man from the dust of the ground. So we are literally created from the place in which we are placed. And I think there's just such a beautiful dependency in that, because we hear later in the Bible, we hear a verse where it says, God knows our frames, and he remembers that we are dust. And so there's a real tenderness and care in being created from this place. We're embedded in a natural world. And that leads me to the second point, that we are created in a place. So God's design is for all of creation to work together in synergy, to be in relationship. And this means that our own health and our flourishing really does depend on the stewarding of creation, of our habitat. We do not stand outside of the world in which we live. And lastly, we are created for a place. We see this in Genesis 1:28 when we're given the command, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. And I will say that historically, growing up in the church, I was taught that this verse really meant to have large families and lots of kids and fill the earth with people. And that is true. But as I've gotten older, I've also seen that this command is far greater than that. It also includes filling the earth with order, with beauty, creating economies, things that work together, that really bring out the goodness of God's creation. So we are people that are placed, and we are created from a place, in a place, and for a place. And y'all, this is a really high honor to be co-creators of our habitat here. Unfortunately, we have entered into a place and a story of displacement, disorientation, and disconnection. We see here in Genesis, this is just after the fall of mankind. In Genesis 3, Adam and Eve have just partaken of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God comes to them and he says, "Where are you?" This is actually the first question that God asks of humankind in the Bible. And I don't think it's a question literally of hide and seek. Adam and Eve, where are you? It's a question of asking them to orient themselves. And unfortunately, what they don't realize is that they've just disconnected themselves from their place. And they are not able to orient themselves because they've entered into exile and they're in disconnection from God and from one another. And this becomes part of the biblical story of redemption, right? Because from this point on, we are all exiles. We are all looking for that place to return home to full connection with God and with one another. Furthermore, you see in the Bible story that there's a strong connection between place and health and flourishing. And when that disconnection happens and that break happens, it also can lead to a lot of vulnerability and shame. You see here in Nehemiah, he's coming back to Jerusalem and he's inquiring about the Israelites who are in exile. And he's asking about the state of Jerusalem. And in this verse, it says, the answer is, "The remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. And as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept." And Nehemiah recognizes that there's a lot of vulnerability that's happening here for the Israelites as the walls of Jerusalem are broken and the gates are destroyed. I like to encourage people to think about this in terms of the modern day reality of broken places. How many times have we heard in movies and even in conversation things that refer to people being from the other side of the tracks? That's automatically a very shameful and vulnerable and negative descriptor that we give. And I think, again, that just reiterates the connection between places and how much that can affect people and their understanding of who they are. Additionally, in our current cultural climate, disorientation has resulted in this disconnection from God, from ourselves, and from one another. And the statistics are quite overwhelming. I don't know if everybody can read these from back there, but according to a 2023 report by the Surgeon General, nearly 50% of all American adults report being lonely. Only 39% of Americans feel socially connected. Only 30% of Americans believe that they can trust other Americans. And only 16% of Americans report feeling attached to their community. Additionally, only 47% of Americans report belonging to a local church, synagogue, or mosque. This is down from 70% that were reported in '99. And this is the first time in the history of this survey being questioned with the Surgeon General that the report is less than 50%. One of the things they have found, too, is that lacking social connection can increase the risk for premature death as much as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. So, this loneliness crisis is a health crisis as well. So the design of our neighborhoods and our places actually plays a really important role in whether we flourish in community as God intended. In fact, the research is also finding that the quality and the length of a person's life has very strong correlations with the zip code in which they live. And more research is finding that about only 20% of our health condition is determined by access to health care and genetics. The remaining 80% is actually related to what we call social determinants, which include things like housing, transportation, jobs, community relationships, access to healthy foods, and safe spaces. All of these things are significantly intertwined with the built environment of our neighborhoods. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that we have built our cities and neighborhoods over the last 50 years in a manner that really gives priority to convenience, consumerism, and cars. And we have neglected people and relationships in much of our design. And we're seeing the social, physical, and mental health effects of this. Research has also found that connectedness is shaped by what we call social infrastructure of the community. Social infrastructure includes physical assets of the community, such as public spaces, libraries, and parks, programs such as volunteer organizations or member associations, and local policies such as public transportation and housing. And I think what's really fascinating is that modern day research is showing this, but biblically, we've seen it from long ago. Because here we have in Jeremiah 29, the Israelites are living in Babylonian exile. And what does God call them to do? He calls them to build houses and to plant gardens. This is so fascinating to me because God is calling his people to invest in land that they do not own. And he is still saying, invest your time, your money, your sweat equity into this land to bless the Babylonians and to bless you. And again, too, I think what's so fascinating about this, it is not a zero-sum proposition. And that's not how the world's economy works these days, right? We live in a world of power dynamics, of haves and have-nots, of winners and losers. But God's economy does not operate this way. Instead, God calls the Israelites to say, bless the Babylonians, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you, and in its welfare, you will find your welfare. And I think that that's really important for us to consider as we think about the resources that we have and the ways that we can bless one another and live generously with those resources. Additionally, God calls them to do very tangible acts. He calls them to build houses and to plant gardens. And it's a very specific place. It's Babylon. And he calls them to seek the welfare of that city. And I think you're only able to seek the welfare of the city when you know the city and you learn what it needs and what the welfare should be. And so it's really entering that public realm with a sense of purpose to bring truth, beauty, and goodness, to really bring shalom. And so in the midst of exile, the Israelites, I would say, are called to be placemakers. And so I like to take this term, placemaking, and think of it biblically in terms of redemptive placemaking. So Ross Hastings, in his book, Identity and a Missional God, writes, mission is not the saving of disembodied souls out of creation, but participation with God in redeeming of whole persons to become fully alive in creation. And y'all, this is not news. I'm sure everybody's fully aware that our country is incredibly polarized, and we have forgotten to practice civic virtue and the art of civil discourse. And so we need to invite people to interact, to know one another, to offer grace and kindness as we maneuver this world together. And so in seeking the welfare of the city, I believe this means building places and designing places that speak to, value, and reflect human dignity. On top of this, the disconnection that we're facing, the pandemic has only added another layer to all of this, right? We feel so disembodied by Zoom, removed from many of the places that once were part of our natural rhythms. And we have a lot of churches who are really struggling and wondering, how do they maintain a physical presence with their members and their buildings? Is there even value in doing this? And I would argue, yes, very much so, because we are embodied creatures. We are given physical senses, touch, taste, sight, smell, and sound. As Christians, we're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus on the ground, to love our neighbors, and to promote human flourishing, empathy, and shalom. So if we can see our place and our embodiment as gifts, then we are oriented to share these things with others rather than preserve for ourselves. So I keep throwing around this term placemaking, and this is a more practical answer to what placemaking means. Project for Public Spaces, they're a group based out of New York. They define it as a people-centered approach for improving a property, neighborhood, or city to collectively reimagine and reinvent public spaces at the heart of every community, to strengthen the connection of people and the places that they share, and to collaborate to shape the public realm, to maximize shared value. So placemaking values and capitalizes on the physical, cultural, and social identities that define a place. It really is those gathering spots, those local institutions and other places that we come together as neighbors, friends, and citizens. Placemaking, I would argue, is part of our cultural mandate as churches, and we have significant opportunities to enter into this work. Now, I know that House of Hope is going through a master planning process and reimagining your property in several ways right now. And I will say that I commend you as a church for many of the works and things that you have already done with your property over the past years to take strides and to be a place in the neighborhood. And so I just encourage you to keep in mind what I'm sharing with you today as you continue this process and continue visioning forward for the future here. I'm going to share with you now some 5 easy placemaking concepts that I like to give churches as a starting point to consider when they're thinking about their property. So the first one is thresholds. Thresholds are really those transition places between the exterior and the interior of a space. And I like to say it's kind of like that friendly sidewalk handshake that you can give to somebody before they're coming in the door of the church. Another good way to think about this is in terms of a sidewalk sale. So how many times are you walking down Main Street or perhaps even Grand Avenue out here and somebody puts the merchandise out on the sidewalk? Well, there's a strategy behind that, because what it does, it gets the person walking by to stop and kind of interact with things, and they start to warm up to a space. And then they might say, oh, well, this is kind of interesting. I'm going to go inside now and check out what they have inside. And so this is a great way to bring people in the door. So what does it mean to have almost a sidewalk sale with your church? Maybe not literally, but figuratively, right? And urban design, they talk about active edges make for active interiors. So what can you do with those active edges? And it's interesting, too. It's a psychological thing, too. As human beings, we need to be warmed up to a space. Christopher Alexander, he's a very well-known urban designer. He talked about it in terms of this gradient of intimacy. So where the most exterior space is the most public, the least intimate, but then slowly, as people are drawn into the space, it reaches new levels of intimacy. And so think about that with the way your home is designed. I mean, I don't think anybody has a house where you walk in the front door into the master bedroom. That would be very awkward and weird. But instead, you oftentimes have kind of almost maybe a foyer or the more informal living room space, and then slowly as you move into the interior of the house, you get to those more intimate spaces. The temple in the Old Testament was also designed this way. You had the most public courtyards, and then again, as you progress into the interior of the temple, you got to the most intimate space, which was the Holy of Holies, and that was only reserved for the high priests, right? So thinking again about that, when somebody's coming to visit, what does it mean to create thresholds to help them warm up to a space? I think what's fascinating is that somebody like me, who's been attending church pretty much my whole life, whenever I visit a new church, it's still intimidating to walk in that front door because I don't know what's going to be on the other side of the door. I don't know what the norms are, kind of the cultural expectations, all of that. And if it's intimidating for somebody like me, who's a very experienced churchgoer, think about what it means for the person who has never been to church or perhaps hasn't been to church in a long time. And so again, what can you do psychologically that even just warms that space up to them before they cross the threshold into the sanctuary or into that door? Are there ways that you can engage with them as a human being to warm them up to your church property? Another thing is having activities. So this is also really important because it adds sociability to a place. It gives people visible presence too. So having ways for people to interact with one another and with a place is important. Again, think about it. We so often turn to our cell phones now, but a lot of times when you're somewhere waiting awkwardly, maybe for your friend to arrive or something, or you're at a bus stop or whatever it might be, there's kind of an awkwardness if there's somebody else standing there and you're both just kind of, but if there's something to kind of talk about and engage with around you, suddenly that like breaks the ice and you feel much freer to interact with a total stranger, right? And so again, what are the things that you can do that create that activity and that help people break the ice with one another and with a place? One of the concepts too in urban design that we talk about is triangulation. And this is what creates synergy for a place. So think of having several things to do that kind of allow people to interact in various ways with the place. One of the examples that I like to give is if you have a place to sit, great, but then also maybe put in a bird feeder or maybe put in some sort of audio component, right? That then allows you to have more interaction with the place, not just to sit and stare into nothing. And then maybe put a trash can, because how often do you come and sit in a place and you maybe have a cup of coffee and you enjoy the spot, and then having a trash can there just makes it convenient just to toss. So think about how do you create a place that has these synergies. Project for Public Spaces also suggests what they call the power of 10. They say have 10 things to do in a place. And I always say that feels really ambitious, so maybe start with 3. But then work your way up. Or what are ways that you can, again, create that synergy of activities? Another element that I encourage churches to think about is having places to rest. We live in a very hurried culture, and rest is not common. So what are the ways that you can invite people to rest and enjoy the property? I think what's really fascinating, too, is that there was a study done a few years ago at the University of Minnesota, a woman who was looking to understand what enabled seniors to age well in place, to be able to stay in their homes and be active in their community and be happy with where they were living. And through her study, what she found, and she was completely surprised by, was that it was actually what we call the micro features of the built environment that were the most impactful. So what this was is having places to rest on a walk, like sit walls or park benches that contributed so much for these seniors as to whether or not they could stay in the neighborhood and be out and about in the neighborhood. Also things like even sidewalks, low curbs, all of these things really contributed to the well-being of their life in the neighborhood. And another important thing was actually connections to religious groups. So the seniors that were more embedded in the local community and embedded with a church or an organization found that they could age well in place much better, and they were happier. So I just thought that's like a really interesting thing, as we take for granted some of these places to rest, but they're actually vitally important to our neighborhoods. Also, I always encourage people to think about those arriving at your church by bike or bus, or who might be coming from a different mode of transportation. Are you providing bike parking? Or is it good bike parking? And then also, too, think about things like on your website. Is there clear directions on your website as to how somebody could come to your church by public transit or by a bike route? Because there are other ways that people can come to church. And so are we thinking of that? Next, beauty. So beauty contributes to the aesthetic value of a place and stimulates curiosity. And y'all, we were created for beauty, and I think we often overlook this. We live in a very functional world in many ways, but how is it that we are created for beauty, and how are we contributing beauty to the world around us? And again, too, there's a lot of beautiful aspects about your property, and so I think that this church has contributed a lot of beauty in the neighborhood here. And I always like to share an experience that was really meaningful to me. I lived in Peru for a year, and where I lived was a coastal desert, and I worked with a mission organization, and they built these beautiful churches with these luscious gardens in some of the poorest neighborhoods in town. And in some ways, you would look at it and you would think, oh, like, what a waste of money. Like, you could be feeding people rather than having this beautiful church and this luscious garden. And when you asked them about why they chose to do that, they would say, the people in these communities have such little access to beauty. And we want to give them a place where they can see that they are dignified, that God has created them in this beautiful world, and we can give them an access to beauty that they otherwise wouldn't find. And I just thought that was such a wonderful picture of Jesus and really being the hands and feet and the beauty of Jesus on the ground. So what are ways that we can contribute beauty? Lastly, I talk about wayfinding. I think this is so key and so easily forgotten because you can do some of these great public space improvements and you're like, oh yeah, this is for the community, and then you forget to tell the community that it's actually for them. And so a lot of times people don't know that they're invited to use these places and to interact. And so again, clarity is kindness. So put out signs, put welcoming things to let people know that it's obvious they're able to be here and to engage. And then too, I always say, use it yourself as well. So often too, I see that churches will do these things to encourage the community to be there and be active and participate, but then the church hardly uses it themselves. How often do we have, church Bible studies like down in the basement or like in an interior office when it's a beautiful day outside and we have park benches outside? So all that does is it brings life to a property and it shows people that there's a way to engage and that there's community happening here. So think about how you can add wayfinding to make sure that people know that this is for them and they're welcome to participate. So now I'm going to talk about the church parking lot. This is the point in the show where you can all throw your popcorn at me or decide how you want to engage with this, because I know that the church parking lot can be one of the most contentious subjects of property development, and that actually can be one of the most contentious subjects of any property development, actually. But the sad reality is that we devote more land to cars than we do for housing in the United States. Parking lots consume 30% of the land in our cities. And Donald Shoup, who's a parking expert, he suggests that there are 8 parking spots per car in the United States. So there's some crazy statistics about how much land is actually devoted to parking. And unfortunately, in some ways they are a necessary thing, but the downside is they produce no tax base for our cities. They cause heat island effects, which can be really bad for the local environment and the wildlife. And we can all, I think, admit that they're just plain ugly. So even though they're necessary, there's also a lot of downsides to parking lots. So how can we reimagine the church parking lot? Well, I like to start off with saying, think about other uses that can be had on the parking lot throughout the week and make sure it's designed to accommodate these things. And I know that you all on this parking lot back here, you house the farmer's market over the past year or so, is that right? Yeah, and so that's a great start. Is there ways that you could paint basketball lines? I have a few churches that I've worked with that have painted basketball courts, and so that people can use it as a neighborhood basketball court. Pickleball, as we all know, is just growing in popularity, so can you make some pickleball courts? Are there other things that can be done with a parking lot to effectively make it more useful to the community throughout the week? I also always encourage churches to think about hosting maybe a bike rodeo. This was a thing in Texas. I don't know if it's as much of a thing in other places since it has the word rodeo in it, but it was a great highlight of my childhood of getting to bring my bike and setting up kind of these obstacle courses that would help me learn how to maneuver my bike better and become a better biker. And so again, is there ways to partner with, I think about like Free Will, it's down there on Grand, the bike shop. Do you partner with Free Will and say, hey, let's host a community-wide event with you all, and we're going to do a bike rodeo on the House of Hope parking lot? So those are some just creative ideas of how you can make this space somewhat more human-friendly throughout the week. Additionally, what we're seeing more and more of, and this is not news to you all probably, is that we are in a housing crisis here in the United States. And more and more, we're seeing that churches are stepping up and answering this with their own properties and thinking about how can we provide housing with either our parking lot or excess land that we have. And so here we have in Detroit some tiny homes that a church was working to build on their property, their lot. This lower project, Calvary Apartments in Minneapolis, Minnesota, is a project that I helped facilitate where Calvary worked with a developer and is having affordable housing units being built on their parking lot. So there's some creative ways to also consider how you might actually use the parking lot in a more robust, long-term way. And I just wanted to give you a sense too. So as I said, affordable housing is a need across the country, and St. Paul really is no different. This is according to the Minnesota Housing Partnership. They just came out with the report in 2023. And what this shows is how many households in Ramsey County are cost burdened by housing. And the definition for cost burdened is anybody who spends more than 30% of their annual income in housing, either through mortgage payments or through rent. And so you'll see that 19% of homeowners in Ramsey County are considered cost burden, and you have 49% of renters are falling into that category as well. And then severely cost burdened are those who are spending more than 50% of their annual income on housing. So you have 24% who fall in that category. And then additionally, down here you see that of these cost burdened households, 81% are considered low income. And then of those low income renters, there's 86% of low income renters are cost burdened. And 66% of senior renters are cost burdened. So as you can see, there is also a great need for affordable housing in our county. And so again, I just challenge you to think about, what does it mean to serve the neighborhood with the property that you have? How do you create those places of public invitation and ways that people can get to know and interact with one another and build community and to fight that trend of isolation and disconnection that we see? And also even thinking more long-term and more robustly and dreaming big, is there things like housing and things like that that could be considered down the road? So I think that this is a great orientation that a church in San Antonio, Texas, came up with several years ago. So as I've said over the course of this talk, I'm from Texas. I grew up in San Antonio. And First Baptist Church in San Antonio, they've been rooted in the downtown neighborhood of San Antonio since the late 1800s, longtime neighborhood residents of downtown San Antonio. They, in talking with me several years ago, they said, we're really challenging ourselves to start asking what we call the nascent questions. And I thought this was so great, and so I've taken it from them and I've used it in my presentations. But looking at the nascent questions. So often we start with, what kind of construction will city regulations allow? Where the nascent question is, what kind of space does our city need? Or how much parking does our church need? The nascent question, how can we meet parking needs without creating an empty lot for the rest of the week? Or how can 2 Sunday school classes and a weekday study best share one room? Who in this city could benefit from this space? Or how long before we run out of space for programming? And the nascent question, how well do we know the venue schedulers and the shopkeepers in our city? And these are some challenging questions, and I think these are questions that you all have been wrestling through as you think about your master planning process here. So I encourage you, again, just to think about, God, how can we serve the neighborhood with this property? What are the creative ways that we can think about providing good space and good programs and, again, fight that trend of social isolation and disconnectedness that is really harmful and harming our local communities, our neighborhoods? And I like to end with this just encouraging verse from Zechariah, because this is what we are working towards, right? This is when we see full redemption on earth as shalom is restored and we are exiles who come home to full connection with one another and with God. And it's such a beautiful picture because I'll just read it to you. It says, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. Once again, men and women of ripe old age will sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each of them with cane in hand because of their age, and the city streets will be filled with boys and girls playing there." And it's such a beautiful picture of what redeemed Jerusalem will look like. And that's what we're moving towards. So how do we, as believers, as followers of Jesus, produce that picture for the world around us with our properties? And so I really encourage you all to think about that, to dream big, and to ask God to move to bring full redemption for your property here, for the Summit neighborhood and the city of St. Paul. So that's all I have for you. I don't know where we are with time and how quickly this wraps up, but if people have any questions, I'm willing to throw it open. Yes.
The House of Hope has an architect
Mm-hmm.
that has been working with us for
Right.
many months and did surveys and perhaps site visits to other churches
Mm-hmm.
that had been having new creative uses of their space or modified or created new space because of community needs.
Yeah.
Have you been exposed to that?
Yes, I have, and actually do know the architect myself. So I've had a few conversations with him as well, and hearing kind of where he's been at in that process with you all and walking alongside of you all with that.
You're coordinating with that,
I am, yes.
that person and their activities.
Yes. Uh-huh.
I mean, I've visited a number of churches here in the metro area that have, I think are getting traction in terms of becoming more of a community center,
Right.
as an example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
St. Andrew's in St. Andrew's Lutheran Church in Montevideo is an example.
Okay.
Central
Yeah.
New York and downtown Minneapolis would be another example.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with either of those two churches?
The one in Minneapolis, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and there's just so many churches. I mean, it's really becoming more of a reality for churches across the country that are rethinking, how do we use our space in a more robust way? How do we think of other creative uses and do some sharing and synergy with other organizations or programming in the neighborhood? So yeah. Yes.
So, as the weather cools,
Mm.
I start thinking about the season of the year that seems to take up most of the year.
Yeah.
When everything's harder to get to,
Mm-hmm.
and the ice and snow and all of that makes life hard. And then the summer when it's really been really hot. And have you thought about climate change or mitigation or things like that with your design? Or how to use spaces like a parking lot
Right.
in winter?
Right. Well, surprisingly, Minnesotans are really hardy, and the winter doesn't seem to be too strong of a deterrent for them. I've had to learn to adjust to that. But I think, having outdoor fire pits and doing some of those type of